Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's conversation at noon, Ghosts of History, the Amistad's Lingering Impact. My name is Rebecca Tabor-Conover. I'm head of public programs here at the Connecticut Democracy Center at Connecticut's Old State House, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's program. As many of you know, our building, Connecticut's Old State House, has a very strong connection to the case of the Amistad, and some of the hearings actually took place in this very building. Today, we are very delighted to welcome back an old friend to the Old State House, Dr. Marcus Rediker. Dr. Rediker is the Distinguished Professor of Atlantic History at the University of Pittsburgh. His books have won numerous awards and been translated into 16 languages. His books include The Many-Headed Hydra, written with a co-author in 2000, Villains of All Nations, The Slave Ship, The Amistad Rebellion, Outlaws of the Atlantic, and most recently, The Fearless Benjamin Lay. Dr. Rediker is also the producer of the prize-winning documentary Ghosts of the Amistad in the Footsteps of the Rebels, which he produced. This film is about the popular memory of the 1839 Amistad Rebellion in contemporary Sierra Leone. Currently, Dr. Rediker is working as a guest curator in the J.M.W. Turner Gallery at Tate Britain. Today, our conversation will focus on his 2014 documentary that I just mentioned. The film chronicles a journey of discovery to Sierra Leone to visit the home villages of the rebels who captured the slave schooner Amistad in 1839. In late 2020, this award-winning film was made available for free viewing on the University of Pittsburgh's YouTube and Vimeo channel. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Marcus Rediker. Welcome.
Hi, Rebecca.
Hello.
Good to be with you again. Thank you for inviting me back.
We're glad to have you with us again.
My pleasure.
To start with, did you want to just give a little background for folks who might not be familiar with the story of the Amistad?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I think people from Connecticut know this historical event very well, but it's a really crucial moment in the struggle against slavery, both in the United States and around the Atlantic. In 1839, a group of 53 enslaved people, 49 men and 4 children, who were being transported from Havana, Cuba to a plantation region in the northern part of Cuba, rose up on board that ship. That vessel was the Amistad. They captured the vessel. The captain was killed in the struggle. They then sailed the vessel about 1,600 miles north to the northern end of Long Island, New York. And just there, the U.S. Navy captured the Amistad and the people who were in control of it, took them to the customs house in New London, and jailed them for a considerable period of time. They were moved to New Haven. They spent most of their time in New Haven jail. But as Rebecca said, they did come to Hartford for legal hearings. So to make a long and heroic and complicated story brief, abolitionists, mostly white abolitionists, entered the jail in New Haven and began to work with the Amistad Africans to mount a legal defense. And this was long and complicated. Both groups influenced the other, the African insurrectionists and the New England abolitionists. And to everyone's astonishment, they actually won their case. The United States Supreme Court ruled that the Amistad Africans were actually free, and they went home. The survivors, the 35 survivors, were repatriated to Sierra Leone in 1842. So this event is very important because not only did it represent kind of resistance from below, and that, by the way, is the kind of history I write, history from below, the history of ordinary working people who not only built the world we live in, but shaped its history in deep and lasting ways. not only was it important in that sense, but it gave a real feeling of hope to enslaved people in many parts of the world that you can rise up and you can win. So I think that the fact that this was a victory, a successful slave ship revolt, and they were very uncommon. This meant that this had a kind of electrifying effect in many areas. Just one more word about history from below. My particular contribution to the really significant scholarship that's been done on the Amistad case was to make the Amistad Africans themselves the heroes of their own story, and to emphasize the rebellion, the successful uprising that took place on the vessel. Most scholars had really been only interested in the legal case. And of course, the legal case is very important. But to my mind, without the uprising, there is no legal case. So the question for me became, how did the Africans on board that ship actually manage to capture it and sail to freedom at a time when the overwhelming majority of slave ship revolts resulted in failure? And my answer to that question was to go back to the African background, back to Sierra Leone, to discover that the training of the men on board the Amistad as warriors, as people who were defending their villages from slave traders, this ended up being the key to their victory. So what I think I added was the African side of the story, and a view of the whole thing that gave agency to the people who made the successful revolt. So I published this book in 2012, and soon thereafter, a colleague of mine, Conrad Tuchscher, St. John's University in New York, a specialist on Sierra Leone, suggested that we go to Sierra Leone to make a film. He wanted to talk to people about the book and the history, but as our plans evolved, we decided that what we really wanted to do was to visit the villages where the Amistad Africans had come from, and to talk to the elders in those villages to see if there was any surviving memory of the Amistad story in the oral tradition. We visited 10 villages in May 2013. We were there about 2.5 weeks. We spoke with numerous elders. We found that, as you might expect, in in 2 or 3 villages there was no memory. In 2 or 3 villages there was a little memory, but in 2 villages in particular there was a lot of memory. And so this is basically the essence of the documentary film that I made with Tony Buba, the director, a really distinguished documentary filmmaker. And as Rebecca said, we've just now been able to make this film available for broad viewing. So I'm here to discuss the film, but also to discuss the Amistad case and talk about this matter that is really so significant in the history of Connecticut.
Well, thank you so much. And a couple things just I needed to mention. One is that when we give tours of the old State House, your book is actually usually one of the ones that I recommend to folks, because you do look at the lives of the captured Africans and bring in their humanity and their differences, that there were individuals. The other thing I wanted to mention for our viewers, that if you have a question for Dr. Rediker, if you want to just post that, we can see it. I see we already have one that's come up, and then I'll ask in a second. But we can take your questions, and also there's a survey there that we invite you to participate in. I'm glad, Marcus, you gave us a little bit of the background about how the documentary came to be, because it seems like most academic books don't lead to a documentary. And so what is it that you think was so different about your work and about the Amistad Rebellion that really lent itself to a documentary?
Well, there are 2 ways to answer that question, Rebecca. One is to say that the Amistad story is really dramatic. It really is an extraordinary instance of people rising up under really difficult circumstances and striking a blow for freedom. There was a saying back in the era of the Amistad Revolt that those who would be free must strike the first blow. And that is what the Amistad Africans did. So I think it lends itself very well to dramatic visual treatment. But the other thing I have to say is that my dean at the University of Pittsburgh, John Cooper, recognized the possibility of this film and was willing to fund it. So I have a lot of colleagues who have written very good books that would make excellent films, but I was really fortunate in that I had strong institutional support. And as a friend of mine put it, she said, let me see if I understand this. You basically got this idea of going to Sierra Leone and driving around the country and went to the dean and said, will you pay for it? And he said, yes. The answer is, yes, he did.
Before you, that's amazing. Before you went to Sierra Leone, in terms of planning for this trip, did you have a good idea of the villages that you were going to go to? Was there some flexibility in your schedule in terms of if you made a discovery to take a trip, or was it pretty planned out?
You know, it couldn't be planned out. And this was something that Tony Buba, the director of the film, was very conscious of and frankly a little worried about. Because normally in making a film like this, you do all sorts of advanced scouting and you work things out and you know exactly what you want to film when you get there. But in this case, we didn't have that option. But what we did have was this extraordinary man named Tazif Karoma, who you've seen in the video, in the film. He was himself a lecturer in linguistics at Foro Bay College in Freetown, Sierra Leone. He was a friend and close colleague of two of the people on our trip, so we had a long working relationship with him, and he basically organized everything. He set up the meetings with the different chiefs. He set up our travel schedule. We didn't always know from one day to the next where we were going to go, what we were going to be able to do. We had a list of questions. We had a list of villages we wanted to see. And we also wanted to find Lomboko, the place where the slave trading factory, where the awful adventure began. No one had been able to find Lomboko for about 50 years. So we set it as our task to try to find it. And we did find it. And that was a really chilling and powerful moment. But we did have to be flexible and adjust to circumstances. In southern Sierra Leone, where we did most of the filming, that is an extremely poor part of the world. There's no electricity in many parts of it. There's no running water in many parts of it. So we really had to, do the best we could, especially with the filming equipment. We had to, for example, hire a generator in order to charge some of it overnight between shoots. So it was really an interesting set of conditions. But I would emphasize that the people whom we met along the way were just exceedingly generous. They really wanted to help us. And that was the key to any success we may have had.
One of our viewers has asked, Professor Rediker has been able to locate and confirm the village associated, and I'm probably going to mispronounce names, so apologies for that, Gilaberu and Fabana. Have any other of the other villages been confirmed?
Yes, the village that Sarah is talking about is called Folu, and that figures prominently in our film. We did have one rather stunning thing happen, and that is that when Gualu, as he's called in his own village, who was the second in command among the Amistad Africans just below Sinke, or Sengbe, as he's known among the Mende, he came back to the village. And we were talking to people in the village about him, and one woman elder said, yeah, he's my ancestor. I'm descended from him. He actually took on a new name when he came back. They called him Johnny because he had lived among these English-speaking people. So this was really quite extraordinary. So yes, that village is confirmed. We did confirm some other villages, even though there weren't as many living memories. For example, Fune, who was a man who actually died just before the Amistad Africans went back. He drowned in Farmington, Connecticut. Some people wondered whether it was a suicide or not, out of desperation that they might never be allowed to go home. We found his village. There was some memory of him, but there just weren't a lot of powerful stories. A really key part of all this was our discovery of a fishing village called Toko in southern Sierra Leone. And these were the people, these fishermen were the people who took us to the island of Lomboko. And one of the elders there, a man named Vandy Massaquoi, had a stunning degree of knowledge of the case. That things he knew things that he could only have known by a really coherent passing down of the Amistad story over about 7 generations. So this was really, really quite extraordinary to be able to meet and talk with him.
Yeah, I'd like to just talk a little bit about Lomboko, because that was so fascinating that you found the location of it. And it kind of brought to mind a couple of questions, one of which was, do you think it's because you did tap into that local lore and knowledge that you were able to find Lomboko when generations of other researchers just never found it?
Absolutely. And I can tell you the moment. I mean, we went to village after village. And after we talked with people about the history of the village and learned more about it and probed to see whether they had any surviving memory of the Amistad case, in village after village, we asked people, do you know where is a place called Lomboko? And we got many different kinds of comments. Some people said they'd never heard of it. Some people said, oh, that place is underwater now. It doesn't exist anymore. Or other people said, oh, that place has gone to bush. Forget it. You'll never find it. So just as we were really on our way out of that region in southern Sierra Leone, we passed a little market area. And Tazif said, stop the car. I just want to duck in here for a minute. And he went around from person to person and said, basically asked them, did your father or grandfather or grandmother or any ancestor ever tell you about a place called Lomboko? And he asked person after person. And he finally met a man who said, I don't know, but I know the people who will know. So he actually got in the car with us and took us to this village called Toko, which was really remote. I mean, the roads that we drove through were really just paths with vegetation scratching the windows of the car all the way. And when we got there, we met this man, Vandy Massaquoi, and a number of other people from the village. And we asked them, do you know about this place, Lomboko? And they said, sure, we fish there all the time. And then we said, can you take us there? And they said, yes, we can. So that was how we were able to go. And it was Tazif's really very shrewd probing and asking the right questions that got us into those circumstances to find Lomboko.
Well, it really was amazing to me that it was really a difference in sand. That was kind of one of your physical clues that you had found Lomboko. Was there any other physical evidence that you discovered that wasn't shown in the documentary?
Yes, there actually was. What you could see in several places on the island were essentially the foundations of what were called barracoons. Those were essentially slave holding pens. These were places where the people who had been delivered by slave traders to this man named Pedro Blanco, a Cuban slave trader who owned and operated Lomboko. He would keep people in these slave holding pens until they could be sent out to the slave ships, which were anchored offshore. They would have to be taken by boat. Boats would be rowed to take people out to the vessels. So we could see the foundations of numerous places, and there really was no reason for any other kind of building to be on this island. So I felt very confident that these were the barracoons. We do still anticipate at some point that a team of archaeologists will go to Lomboko and do a proper dig, and thereby, I think, fully confirm what we are pretty sure is already the truth of the find. So we're still hoping for that. We haven't made more progress on that because not long after we left Sierra Leone, an Ebola epidemic broke out. And then, of course, we've had the pandemic since then. So we have not been able to return. But we do hope to return, and we do hope that someone will eventually do that archaeological work.
Well, in a lot of the B-roll that on the documentary, there were abandoned slave forts pictured. Do you think they are forgotten places, or do you think in some ways they're intentionally abandoned to leave behind the memory of slavery times?
Well, the big slave trading fortresses, like the one on Bunce Island in Sierra Leone, is one of about, I think there are about 30 of them that stretch from Senegal down the coast of West Africa to Angola and Congo. There are about 30, maybe 35 of these forts. Some of them are very, very important tourist destinations, especially one in Ghana, Elmina Castle. There's another big one in Ghana called Cape Coast Castle. So these big fortresses are there kind of haunting the landscape, frankly. I mean, when we came to Bunce Island, it just was so eerie to think of the thousands of people who had passed through this still monstrous, although decaying structure. It's falling down. The stone is falling down, and it won't last forever. There have been some efforts to restore these, but unless there's a significant number of tourists coming to see the area, it really isn't feasible to do. Now, that's one kind of slave trading fortress. The smaller places like Lomboko are really almost completely forgotten. There are very few of those. That's because they don't leave much architecture. And so it is. We do know that there were lots of smaller scale trading factories up and down the coast, but that's one of the things that makes the discovery of this place all the more significant.
Well, in the United States, I think the legacy of slavery is something we're still grappling with in 2021. What is the sense in Sierra Leone of those times, and how do they handle that kind of part of their historical past?
Well, it's complicated and it's vexed. It's not simple. It's not easy for people in Sierra Leone to talk about slavery. Now, they don't talk about it the same way we do, but they did have domestic slavery. It went on for a long time. It wasn't chattel slavery or plantation slavery of the kind that we have. So these people who like to say, oh, they had plenty of slavery in Africa, so nothing was new in the New World, that is simply untrue. Because slavery, such as it was, it might be better to call it servitude, was mostly familial in Sierra Leone. People were adopted into families. And so it had a very different sort of social context. It also meant that people weren't being worked to death as they were on many plantations that we find in Virginia, South Carolina, and the Caribbean. But Rebecca, we actually, I should say Tony Buba actually began work on our film addressing the theme, what does slavery mean in contemporary Sierra Leone? And we got about halfway down that path, and he realized that it was too complicated and we couldn't deal with it in a 1-hour documentary. It also meant that if we were going to do that, we would have had very little time to talk about the Amistad case. And that, of course, was our main purpose. But I'll just say this. In Sierra Leone, there are some culture groups who cooperated with the slave traders, and there are other culture groups who were primarily its victims. And as you can imagine, they don't have the same attitude toward the slave trade. People who have been able to watch the film might have noticed that in the first third or a little more of the film, we're actually talking to the descendants of the leading African slave trader in that region, a man named King Shaka. They regard their ancestor as a great man, and they don't necessarily regard slavery as a big problem. But if you go inland to the areas where people were actually forcibly seized as in Folu and in many other areas in Mende land, you find a very different attitude toward the slave trade because those people really suffered from it.
Well, one thing that I found really interesting about the documentary, Marcus, is almost seeing two threads of study come together from the U.S. and from Africa. And it's very interesting in Sierra Leone that it's a culture that is much more based on oral tradition. And it seemed as if with your work going there, you found out so much amazing information that past historians have not found. And do you think with, greater accessibility with technology and travel, do you see kind of those threads coming together as part of the future of the study of history? And can you talk a little bit about that?
Rebecca, I hope so. And in fact, it was an effort to combine those threads that led us to undertake this project. The oral tradition is very rich. It exists in Sierra Leone and many other parts of the world, certainly in Ireland, in Native America. The oral tradition is extremely important. And there are treasures of knowledge within that tradition that historians trained like me, as a historian who works with documents, can't access unless you go to a place that you're studying and talk to people about it. So yeah, this was the first time I had really done oral history. Normally I study a time so long ago that there really isn't any oral history about it. But the other thing I would mention, Rebecca, is that oral history as a system is fragile, in the sense that you may have noticed a couple of times in the film, people said to us, well, the person who would have known that just died. And we don't, and sometimes the stories die with that person if they're not really fully disseminated to the next generation. And here's one thing I would mention. Sierra Leone is a very poor country, the 7th or 8th poorest country in the world, because of the slave trade and also because of British imperialism. And one of the biggest enemies of the oral tradition is premature death. Because when people die young, that ruptures the transmission belt by which the stories are usually conveyed. So we were conscious that we were interviewing people in an area where there had been a really brutal civil war that lasted more than 10 years in Sierra Leone. And we actually talked to people who said that their graveyards were quite full of people who lost their lives in that conflict. And I couldn't help but wonder how many stories were lost with the deaths of those people. One thing my two colleagues from Sierra Leone hope to be able to do is to involve students at Poro Bay College in going to the villages with tape recorders and taking down some of the oral histories and maybe preserving them in that way.
Well, it seems that you found a great team for this documentary. And what did you think in terms of each team member, and did they bring a different perspective to the job?
Well, the first and most important decision I made was to contact Tony Buba, the filmmaker. Tony is, like I said, extremely accomplished. There are retrospectives of his films all over the US and around the world. He's a specialist in what's called working class film. Most of his films have been about the deindustrialization, the decline of the steel industry in his hometown of Braddock, Pennsylvania. And he produces these very human, very poignant stories about the costs of deindustrialization, the human costs. And I had known Tony for a number of years. I had great respect for him as a filmmaker. And so when I realized that I had this opportunity to make the film, I contacted him right away. And to my great good fortune, he immediately said, yes, let's go. Even though this was something completely new for him, traveling to a place like Sierra Leone to do the film. Tony then assembled a film team. He then hired a very distinguished cinematographer, John Rice, someone with whom he had worked for a long time. We also brought along Jan McManus, Tony's wife, who played a very important role in numerous ways. And we hired a Sierra Leonean filmmaker named Idris Kapanga, who was really crucial in all kinds of ways. In fact, he shot all of the footage on the trip to Lomboko because Tony had cut his toe and really could not get into a canoe full of swamp water. So that was the film crew. The other people, the two historians, Konrad Tuchscher and Philip Misevich, are both Sierra Leone specialists who had spent a lot of time in the country doing research. So that knowledge was crucial. And even more crucially, they both knew Tazif Karoma. And he is really the key to the entire thing. His knowledge just governed everything we did. And he's actually from the region where we did most of the filming. He speaks a wide number of languages. I told you he's a linguist. And the respect that villagers had for him, especially the chiefs in the villages, was the main reason why they were not only willing, but eager to talk to us and to share their history with us. They really wanted to help us because they trusted Tazif.
Great. And before you went, was there one member of the Amistad group you were most eager to learn more about, and who did you learn the most about in the end?
Well, the key to the whole story is Sinke, or Sengbe. That's his Mende name. He's known as Sengbe. And of course, we wanted to learn everything we could about him. There's more known about him than anybody else because he played such a leading role. But we did find out some fascinating things. For example, we visited the village of a local king in whose army Sengbe had fought. So we got to see the sort of whole complex of how the fighting went on in that region. We also, on our very last day in Sierra Leone, we were literally just on our way back to fly out, we had a meeting with a woman elder, and this woman had the most extraordinary memory. In other words, her knowledge of her region of Sierra Leone went back further than anybody else we talked to. And even though she didn't know a lot about Sengbe in particular, she knew a lot about his village, and she was able to address one question for us, which was this. When Sengbe got back to Sierra Leone in 1842, he wanted to find his wife and children. So he went back to his village and discovered that it had been leveled, destroyed by King Shaka's army, most likely, and people there probably enslaved. This woman knew where the refugees from that village went. And so we did not have time to follow up on it. But she was an extraordinary repository of knowledge, and she said to us that this was knowledge passed along among the women of her family, that this was a female body of knowledge. So if I had it all to do over again, I would try to find the female equivalent of Tazif Karoma, because I think that would open up a whole new world of knowledge and information to us.
Do you have plans to return or to continue?
We actually, before the pandemic, had hoped to be there right around now, or maybe in May, because we were actually organizing screening of the film in Freetown, and we also wanted to take it, have always planned to take the film back to the villages that we visited to show the people there what this looked like. Now, Tony Buba, the filmmaker, had a really fascinating point. You noticed probably, Rebecca, that in Folu, a lot of people were filming us with their cell phones. They're holding up their cell phones and taking photos and film of the elders talking to us about the Amistad case. Tony says, I want to get back there and see that film that they shot of us and see what kind of stories they tell about our visit. And maybe he could even incorporate some of their film into a new film about our adventure and really incorporate their point of view as to what was actually going on in our discussions.
That would be really fascinating. It's we did have one question come up from our audience from Alan. Can Marcus say what impetus the Amistad case gave to resistance to slavery and ultimately to abolition?
Yes, this is a very interesting question because the Supreme Court, which ruled on the Amistad case, ruled on it in a very narrow way to try to limit its impact. In other words, most of the members of the Supreme Court, by the way, were Southerners, and several of them were slave owners. So they were not inclined to render decisions that were favorable to the abolitionist movement in any way. So what they did was rule very narrowly that the Amistad Africans were free because Cuban slave traders had violated a treaty that Great Britain had made with Spain a few years earlier. And so in that sense, they were technically liberated. But what I found in the course of doing research for the book was that you can rule narrowly on the legal case, but you can't stop the information and knowledge about the successful revolt from circulating. And here I came into a whole set of new discoveries that really surprised me. For example, in Connecticut, there were all kinds of sympathetic artists going into the jail, drawing pictures of the Amistad Africans. One person created a panorama that was actually longer than the Amistad vessel itself, in which he painted a picture, a sort of an account of the revolt. And then he charged admission to let people come in and look at the panorama. But these artists, there was a play written about the Amistad that was performed in the Bowery Theater of New York. There was just all this popular interest, and a lot of it was extremely sympathetic. The play was sympathetic. The portraits were sympathetic. When people in Connecticut, white people in Connecticut, actually got a chance to go into the jail and meet these Africans, many of them were actually impressed. And they went home and they wrote something about this to someone else, or they wrote something for the local newspaper. So it turns out that a kind of movement grew up around the case in Connecticut in support of the Amistad Africans and in support of the abolitionists who were involved. So this had a really kind of electrifying effect. I'll just give one example. After this successful revolt, one of the most interesting things that happened in the abolitionist discourse about slavery is that leading abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison and Henry Highland Garnett began to publish direct appeals to the enslaved. Now, these would be published, and of course, it was a big problem trying to distribute these pamphlets on Southern plantations because abolitionist literature sent by the mails was always confiscated before it entered Southern states. But they started addressing the slaves directly and started acknowledging that their resistance was going to be crucial to bringing slavery to an end. And lo and behold, when the Civil War finally broke out, it was the resistance of enslaved peoples on the plantations that made a huge difference in the ability of the North to win the war. So I see the Amistad case as one thing among many that's sort of building towards eventual emancipation.
You talked a little bit, Marcus, about some of your plans to go back to show the documentary, and you had mentioned also the possibility of archaeology being done at Lomboko. And I wondered, when the documentary was released in 2014, did more information come to light as a result of that? And what else would you like to learn when you do go back and in further study?
Yes. Well, I'll tell you one astonishing thing that happened. We showed the film at the Schomburg Library in New York. And after the film, a woman stood up in tears and said, my husband is from the village of Folu, and I never knew about this connection to the Amistad Africans. So I think the film has had the film and the book, I should say, have had the effect of increasing people's interest in the African side of the story. I think there is some new research being done on the case. There's a very good forthcoming book by someone who studied at Yale named Joseph Yanelli, who has studied when the Amistad Africans went back, they took a group of missionaries with them, and they established what was called the Mende Mission. They actually built a mission and used it to try to really spread the word of Christianity, but also to fight against slavery. So Joe Yanelli sees this as a very important part of the Underground Railroad, kind of operating in Sierra Leone. So I still think there's a lot to be learned. I especially think there's a lot to be learned by interviewing elders, but I worry a bit that the time is running out. Just to give you one example, Rebecca, Folu, the village where we really had an extraordinary time, was right in the burning heart of the Ebola zone. So if you looked at a map of where deaths happened in Sierra Leone, you would see that that village of Folu was there right in the heart of it. And I'm very worried. I don't know, but I'm very worried that the people that we talk to, many of them may now be gone. I just don't know. So there is a kind of urgency to the recovery of this history. And I think, as soon as we can get back, we will. But I hope other scholars will join us, not just in Sierra Leone, but in other places where there are endangered archives and where there are also, there's a great deal to be learned by interviewing people about the oral tradition.
Does the Mende mission still exist, or
it does not still exist, although we didn't go there, but it is known where it was. Joe Yanelli went there, and he's talked to people about it. So there are people in Sierra Leone who would like to use some of this history to create what they call heritage tourism. I actually hope that nothing like that happens at Lomboko until the archaeologists get in there, because it is possible that some damage could be done to the site. But a man named Joe Opala has been working for years to take Fort Bunce and to make that into something that people visit, and actually they do. It's a really, as I said, eerie and moving structure. So yeah, there's quite a bit of interest in this history in Sierra Leone, at Poro Bay College and in the public. This man we interviewed in the film, called Charlie Hafner, is a playwright, and he actually wrote a play called Amistad Kata Kata, which means Amistad, big struggle or big explosion. And he went around from village to village performing the play in order to teach people about the history. I thought that was a really fascinating thing to do. So it's still a subject, I think, that permits a lot of creativity, and I still do believe in the old biblical injunction when it comes to evidence: seek and ye shall find.
Well, it's a fascinating story, and as I said before, we love your book, and it's interesting to hear that more are forthcoming. I think when anyone who's read the Amistad Rebellion, I think one of the really key points to what you covered in that book was about the Poro Society and its total importance in really being able to form a society amongst different cultures. And I was just wondering if that society still exists in Sierra Leone, and is it still that very secretive kind of society?
It does still exist, Rebecca. It's still very important to village life. And we made a big mistake in Freetown in talking about it. When I gave a lecture at Poro Bay College before we went to the South, I spoke to historians and students, and some village elders came, and not really understanding how sensitive a subject the Poro Society was, I talked about its role in organizing the rebellion. That the Poro, for people who may not know, is an all-male secret society. There's an equivalent female secret society. It's called the Bundu or the Sunday Society. But the men's society, the Poro, is the place where decisions are taken, like when to declare war, when to go to battle. And so on the Amistad, I thought that in the hold of that ship, when they are deciding whether to rise up and try to capture it, it was actually a Poro meeting. But it was really hard to find the evidence for that. I did ultimately find it. But anyway, so I'm talking about this. And when I mentioned the Poro Society in this lecture, there's like this electrical shot of tension that goes through the audience. And I thought to myself, oh no. Well, at the end of the talk, the leading historian of Sierra Leone in the history department at Fort Bay College did a very kind thing. He stood up. His name is Joe Ali. He stood up and he said, yes, we have to be willing to talk about the Poro Society when it comes to significant historical events like this. So he sort of covered up my gaffe. Tazif, though, afterwards pulled me aside and said, we're not going to talk about the Poro Society in public anymore. He said, so I got the message. We didn't talk about it in any of the villages. It's just not something that it will ever be discussed with an outsider. People will talk about it with Tazif, but they wouldn't talk about it with us. And I respected that. And in fact, that was our whole methodology, you might say, for making the film. Absolute respect for the people we met and the cultures that they represented. That was the most important thing that we could bring to the interaction.
I think that really resonates in the documentary. Another questions come in from our audience. Marcus from Aaron, and he asked, what kind of historical memory exists in the villages? What is the nature of the stories and oral histories? Are the Amistad captives considered heroes or victims or something else?
Yeah, I love that question. I'm Aaron. I'm not a specialist on Sierra Leone, so I can't really speak about the storytelling traditions that operate there. I have studied the Mende storytelling tradition, but let me give you two examples which I think illustrate the extremes of how the Amistad Africans are regarded. I mentioned earlier that we spent time talking to the descendants of King Shaka. And when we were in King Shaka's village, which is called Gendima, I was talking to the town chief. And after we had talked, and he really didn't know much about the Amistad, I just asked him point blank. I said, have you heard of it? And he said, no. And I said, well, these were a group of Africans who were enslaved by King Shaka, brought here or other villages, sent to Lomboko, and then shipped out to Cuba. I said, is there any memory of them? And this town chief looked at me with genuine surprise, and he said, why would we be interested in them? They were just slaves. Okay, so that sort of tells you that something about how they were regarded. But when you're in the village of Folu, it's a completely different circumstance. And when it was known that we had information about their ancestor Johnny, you can see it in the film, the level of interest is just extraordinary. And then when they learned that I had a drawing of Johnny and could show that to people, to show them what their ancestor looked like, this created extraordinary excitement. And one man told me, we didn't get it on film, he told me, he said, there are a lot of people in our village who look like him. So he was part of it, and as I said, we found one of his descendants. So in the village of Folu, he was a hero. He was an extraordinary hero. He was a great man, and he was a really fascinating historical figure. He was a very highly placed figure in the Poro Society, and the way you could tell that was because his body had different sorts of scarifications, which indicated his very high level of initiation. So he was someone who was very well respected among the Amistad Africans and among the people in his village. He was a very important person.
But I know we're kind of getting to the end of our time together. Marcus, I know your career has really been in telling history from below, from working class perspective, and from the role of the ordinary folks. What did this experience in terms of writing the book about the Amistad and this documentary, how has that impacted your career and other research projects that you've gone on to?
Well, Rebecca, let me tell you the first thing, which is I had published the book before we went to Sierra Leone. And so I was therefore terrified that I might go there and learn a lot of things that contradicted what I had said in the book. Now, fortunately, that didn't happen. In fact, the opposite happened, because I had argued that the Poro Society was really critical to the success of the rebellion. And then this man named Ernest Ndomahina, who is a member of the Wundi, the Mende Secret Warrior Society, totally unprompted, said the key to the rebellion is the Poro Society. So he made that point, and I was so relieved and so happy. But I would say that both writing the book and doing the film have had a very strong impact on me in the sense that going to this place and talking to people made the history real to me in ways that it couldn't have been just by studying documents. And I will be forever grateful for that. I was not allowed by my editor to rewrite the book, but I was allowed to write a new epilogue that took into account these experiences of Mende culture and talking to people like Professor Ndomahina and the tremendous amount of knowledge that they imparted. I mean, our film was a quest for knowledge, a quest for local knowledge about this very important event that we knew only from the perspective of American documents, right? Documents produced over here. Documents frequently about Africans written down by American scribes who had no idea what their names actually were or how they sounded or what they meant. This is one of the things that happened in the villages. Several of the elders would explain to us the meaning of somebody's name. And this was kind of fascinating. So it really did confirm my faith in history from below, that there are all these means by which you really can learn about the people who have been silenced in the past. You can learn about their lives. You can learn about how they thought. The Amistad case is just tremendously well documented. You know, the number of sources about the Amistad Africans is extraordinary. So we can do this kind of history. This is one of the things that really struck me very powerfully as I was doing this work.
And maybe just to end with, what does it mean to you and to have had the documentary released for use by the University of Pittsburgh so that it's accessible to anyone? And I should mention, we'll post a link to the documentary as well in our comments so that everyone who's watching, if you have not had a chance, you can do that.
Yes, please do. We originally had a distributor, a very good distributor, Alexander Street Press, who handled the distribution of the film for us. We didn't really have the staffing to be able to handle that, but they really marketed it only to other universities and at a pretty high price. So I began a campaign several months ago. Since the University of Pittsburgh paid for the production of this film, they own the copyright. So I started talking with my dean. Can we make this film available to the general public? Because my goal in making it always was for people to use it, like you're using it for the museum. I mean, I have the highest respect for museums and libraries, but also for middle and high school teachers who might be able to use the film, for students. I've just gotten involved in a program here in Pittsburgh called Teen Screen, which is showing the film to various high schools when their teachers want to make it part of the curriculum. So it's been tremendously valuable. And to be honest, one reason I wanted to make the film was to find a new way to bring history from below to people. In other words, there are only so many people who are going to read your book. I accept that. But there are a lot of people who watch movies, who watch documentaries, who can watch YouTube, Ghost of Amistad has been on PBS numerous times. So that you reach a much larger share of the public, and I'm really committed to doing that. So I'm very, very happy that the University of Pittsburgh was willing to do this. It did mean foregoing royalties on their part, but they felt that the educational mission and possibilities of the film were great enough. And if there are people watching this who are teachers who want to use the film, community activists, I'm doing an event next Sunday with the city of Paterson, New Jersey. Rebecca, you might be interested to know they've declared an Amistad Remembrance Day.
Wow.
Yeah, in Paterson, and they're very interested in history from below. So we're going to do an event like that. So anything that I can do to help this story to circulate, I'm more than happy to do. And the film has really made that possible at a much higher level.
Well, thank you so much for visiting with us again. It's good to see you and have you back. I'm glad to all of our audience for joining us and for the great questions. And thank you so much. We'll look forward to talking with you, hopefully, after your next trip to Sierra Leone and hear more about the discovery.
Thank you. Thank you, Rebecca.
And I'd like to just invite those of you who are joining us today, if you would be so kind to fill out the survey about today's program. And I would also ask that you join us for our next programs that are coming up. On Thursday, March 11th at 7 p.m., we'll be celebrating Women's History Month with Female First, exploring the legacy of Ella Grasso. Ella Grasso, as you probably know, was the first woman elected in her own right to be governor of a state in the United States. And then on Thursday, March the 18th, at 7 o'clock join us for a program celebrating Latina women with shedding history of Latina history. On Wednesday, March the 24th, join us at 6 o'clock for an Encounters program on Bushnell Park and the paradoxes of urban renewal. We hope you'll join us for those programs. Thanks again to Dr. Rediker for joining us for today's program. It's really been fascinating to chat with you and delve into that documentary. If you've not had a chance to do so already, do watch it. You're in for a real treat and to learn a lot. So thank you all for joining us. Have a great afternoon.